Coming up today on LinkedIn News Live, millions of women have been driven out of the workforce due to COVID-19, and research shows that they'll face significant biases when re-entering the labor market or being promoted. So how do we avoid unwinding years of progress towards gender equality? We speak with three powerhouse women for their take on a very important International Women's Day for our series, Conversations for Change. Next. Hello, I'm Caroline Fairchild, and welcome to LinkedIn News Live, where the business conversation begins with you. It's March 8th, and here's a quick look at the top headlines trending right now on LinkedIn. Homelessness soars nationwide. Senate passes $1.9 trillion relief bill. And hashtag choose to challenge is the theme for International Women's Day 2021. Let's take a deeper dive into that story. 47 countries are hosting events today in honor of International Women's Day this year with the hashtag choose to challenge. Organizers are asking supporters to raise their hand to show your commitment to choose to challenge inequality, call out bias, question stereotypes, and help forge an inclusive world, according to the IWD website. This year's IWD comes as the world grapples with a global health crisis that has disproportionately impacted women, especially in the workplace. Joining me now to discuss is Rachel Skull-Thomas. She's the co-founder and CEO of leanin.org, as well as optionb.org, as well as Minda Harts, the CEO of The Memo. Rachel and Minda, hello, welcome to LinkedIn News Live.
Good morning. Excited to be talking to you on International Women's Day.
Yeah. Excited to talk to you both on any day, but particularly on this day. Rachel, I'm going to start with you. Let's just dive deep into this. International Women's Day, in many cases, is just a case for brands to just show their support of women. What does real support look like right now, particularly given the context of COVID-19 and just how impacted women have been in this pandemic?
Sure. Real support is systemic change. So that is a higher minimum wage, more paid leave, access to affordable health care. There's a huge wage gap in this country, as so many people listening and tuning in know. That needs to be closed. So women were not in a great financial situation, particularly Black and brown women heading into the pandemic. So it's no surprise that they are disproportionately being impacted by it. And on top of that, we know that it's a critical moment for companies to be retaining, promoting, hiring, and rehiring women. And that's why we think this year's theme of choosing to challenge bias is so important, because we know that bias holds women back in hiring and promotions. They're more likely to be overlooked. And we know 3 in 4 women experience bias or microaggressions in the workplace. And that also slows down their progression.
And Minda, I'll go to you. Your book, The Memo, it just burst onto the scene and basically brought in a different conversation to the situation that we're dealing with right now in corporate America, where unfortunately a lot of diversity and inclusion efforts are only supporting white women. They're not supporting women of color. What has this past year been like for you, and what does International Women's Day mean to you?
Yeah, again, thank you for the conversation. And like Rachel said, 3 in 4 women experience bias. And if you're a woman of color, you probably feel like you experience bias all throughout your day. And so I think it's really important that we talk about the intersectionality when we talk about women, making sure that all women are supported in the workplace. And as we all know, women have been affected over the pandemic, but what we really have to touch on is Black and brown women. Black women and Latinx women have been affected. And to Rachel's point, we already saw inequalities for many of us in the workplace. So now everything is just compounded. So it's important that we really talk about these things and make sure we're holding our leaders and accountable for change, that we're calling out the bias and we're challenging it.
And Rachel, Leanin is choosing to challenge through these 50 Ways to Fight Bias program and this deck of cards that you have on your website. This isn't something that Leanin started this year. It's been a few years, I think, that you've had these cards. How have the situations changed? What are the biases that you're hoping to portray, particularly this year in COVID-19?
Yeah, for people who are unfamiliar with the program, it has grown to almost 100 ways to challenge bias. And the idea behind it is we know that many employees don't challenge bias even when they see it. 1 in 3 employees and 1 in 3 managers challenge bias. Again, even when they see it. And a lot of that is because they don't know what to do. So this is 100 specific situations of bias in the workplace, very specific, which we're going to talk about in a minute. And then on the back, or there's a digital version where it's not quite a back, but you get the idea. It says what to do based on research and experts. And then also more than that, why it happens, which is where where I have learned the most is understanding what's at the root of the bias, because then you can apply that learning to different situations. And how the deck has changed, or the program has evolved over time. It's a couple of years old. It was intersectional from the start, but it has become, I would say, a deeply intersectional program. Half the situations are situations that are faced by women of color, LGBTQ plus women, women who are immigrants, women with disabilities. And as Minda said, we know that LGBTQ plus women, women with disabilities, women of color, particularly Black women, experience far more acute biases. So we really need to address their unique experiences and the bias they're facing head on.
Well, that's exactly why I wanted both of you to join me on the show today. We're going to change some of those statistics, Rachel, hopefully right now here on LinkedIn News Live in terms of the number of managers who are calling out bias. Let's walk through some of these scenarios. And if you're joining us in the stream, we want to get your comments as well. We'll bring you into the discussion. So let's bring in the first bias scenario that we're going to discuss. Okay, here we go. At an all-staff meeting, your company's leaders share concrete goals for hiring, promoting, and retaining women, but it's clear they haven't set goals specifically for women of color. Minda, this is something that's near and dear to your heart. Let's start here. What do you do? How do we check this out?
Yeah, I'm excited to say that I partnered with Lean In on these very important cards for managers, for leaders, for women, because we also can be support systems for each other. But when this happens, I know that sometimes you can feel paralyzed in the moment, not knowing what to do. But when we're in these situations, everybody knows that it might feel uncomfortable, but it's important for us to leverage this conversation, because when we say gender, many companies are only focusing on gender. They're not looking at race and gender and making sure that no woman is left behind in regards to retaining and advancing in their career. So it's important that we talk about specifically what are the metrics for women of color in the workplace and how we're going to retain and advance them. And then if you feel like, you want to lean into your courage a bit, asking that question in regards to what are the specific goals and metrics for women of color. And it's so important, again, that we talk about it, because only 7% of companies are tracking specifically for women of color and their advancement in the workplace. So there's so much opportunity for advancement for all women in the workplace when we challenge the bias.
And Rachel, that stat that Minda just called out, 7% are only really taking this intersectional approach to tracking both gender and race in terms of the equality that they have on their teams. Are you seeing that change? I think I asked you this question a couple months ago, but now it's been a couple months. Hopefully there's been more progress. Are we seeing more companies tracking this, not just gender, not just race, but gender and race?
So the last time we checked was our Women in the Workplace study, which we conducted last April. So I don't have new data on it. I do think that 2020, for a lot of reasons, was a year where companies really doubled down on racial equity. But the thing that, historically you'll hear, and Minda, you jump in, but you'll hear women of color say, there's gender diversity efforts, there's racial equity, efforts. Where are the efforts specifically focused on the experiences of women of color? Because women of color face biases because they're women, and on top of that, biases because of their race and ethnicity. So we really do need more organizations taking that intersectional approach. And Caroline, I'm willing to bet when we see next year's numbers, they're still not going to look that great. That only 7% of companies are setting goals for advancing women through the lens of both gender and race and ethnicity means we're overlooking a whole ton of women of color.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, let's bring up the next bias situation that we have for you in the stream. And if you're joining us, please weigh in. If in an informal conversation with colleagues, someone interrupts and talks over a woman who speaks English as a second language. Rachel, what are we dealing with here in terms of how we should approach this?
So I feel like we've all read the articles on mansplaining and interruptions, but first of all, I do want to say that women are more likely to interrupt other women too. And when we talk about bias, we really need to remember it's really all genders that are falling into bias traps. It's not just about men v. women. So just kind of putting a little plug in that, because I think that's important to say. But we do know that women tend to get less airtime tend to get interrupted more, spoken over. It's worse for women of color. And as we're seeing here, it's worse for women who speak English as a second language. And that's because we generally think, because of lots of stereotypes, that women tend to be a little less competent. And if you don't speak English in an English-speaking country like the US, we tend to again think you're a little less competent. So one of the things that you can do is you can interrupt the bias pretty easily in the moment without getting too far out on a limb. You can say, hey, I really was, interested in what Minda was saying. Could we create some space for her to finish her thought? If you feel like women are not getting enough airtime in meetings, regardless of their identity, and look for it, and you'll really notice they're not, you can say, hey, does anyone else have anything to say? Or we haven't heard from Caroline. I'd love to create a little space for her. So those are just some really basic things that we can do to make sure women are getting more airtime. And the only final thing I would say is, now that we're having a lot of Zoom meetings, you can also use comments to slow the conversation down or circle back on an idea. And so let's use those comments as a way to level the playing field during virtual meetings.
Yeah, for my part, Rachel, I've actually seen a lot of the male leaders in my company do just that, use comments to make sure that people are joining the conversation. And it's the first time that I've seen, obviously, a lot of male allies actually step in and lean into this work. So I think that's a great sign. All right, let's go to the next situation that we have for you in the stream right now. You hear a woman being criticized for her leadership style. Oh, this is the big one. For example,
this one gets under all of our skins, right? Yes.
Out for herself. As a woman who has been called aggressive in the workplace, this is one that is very near and dear to my heart. Minda, I'll start with you. What stereotypes are we dealing with here?
Yeah, we're dealing with a lot of stereotypes. The angry Black woman, the docile Asian, the feisty Latina, and oftentimes women, but particularly women of color, we don't often get to speak our voice in the way that is welcomed, because we're walking on eggshells all the time, hoping not to lean into this perpetuated, unfair, biased stereotype of women speaking up. And so I think this right now is a lot of opportunity for our colleagues and our managers to really lean into their allyship and dismantle those. I know as women of color, I get so many emails during this time of the year for evaluations that they're worried that their managers are going to again call them aggressive or hard to approach. And this is where our managers or our colleagues can say, no, that hasn't been my experience with Minda, but I know that Rachel also has some things. But I think that this is a very good opportunity for us to challenge the bias and make space for everybody to feel like they can bring those authentic pieces of themselves without being labeled something that has nothing to do with who they are in the workplace.
And Rachel, this is a trope that we've just seen play out time and time again in the workplace. Is it changing? Are you seeing progress? I'm choosing to challenge this stereotype right now in this conversation. Why are we still talking about this? And what can managers do to ensure that these stereotypes, as unconscious biases, aren't creeping into their work?
Yeah, I mean, the reason I think we're still seeing it is rooted in a deep-seated stereotype. When men assert themselves, when they take the lead, this goes all the way back to the playground. We remember this. You cheer them on when they take the lead and assert themselves. Not always the case for women. So two things just to kind of share. One is a probing question is generally a good strategy for pushing back on bias. So in a situation like this, you could say, what makes you think that? Like, why do you think she's aggressive? We know from research, people will often be kind of prompted to rethink their biases if they literally are asked to explain them. Mm-hmm. And then the second thing I think is important is the why this matters. Who are you more likely to promote? The man with really high performance marks who everybody really likes, or the woman with really high performance marks, but people think she's a little sharp elbowed, or she's a little bit difficult to work with. That's exactly right. You're more likely to promote the man with the high marks and the high likability. And that's one of the reasons this bias really matters.
Well, Rachel and Minda, I so appreciate you joining me on LinkedIn News Live to choose to challenge all these biases that we're discussing. I'm seeing so many great comments in the stream. One from Miriam, who says, I feel that we all, in one way or another, have experienced discrimination in many ways. We should definitely address the situation the moment it happens. And then Rachel, as always, great to talk to you, especially on International Women's Day.
Thank you.
That was Rachel Skull-Thomas of Lean In, as well as the Memos, Minda Harts. I want to thank them for joining us on the show. All right. International Women's Day is about celebrating the career paths of female professionals. And our next guest certainly has a lot to celebrate. Padma Lakshmi is Emmy-nominated food expert, television host, producer. She's also known as India's first supermodel. Beyond her work in front of the camera, she is a longtime champion for women and girls. Padma, welcome to LinkedIn News Live.
Hi, thank you for having me today.
It's great to see you. What happened to your dog that I saw in the green room?
I'm just trying to be semi-professional, but she's still here.
I wish I had my dog with me, but he's not necessarily as cooperative, I would say.
She's very docile. She's just a little needy, so I'm going to put her back here.
It's International Women's Day, so we want to celebrate all the women in our lives, including our little furry friends.
Including Davina. We just got her 3 months ago in November, I guess, around Thanksgiving, sort of, like everyone else, as a reaction to COVID. Do you want to get down?
Yeah, it's a common thing. I got a COVID pup as well. It's so great to be with you. I'm such a fan of you, of Top Chef, of all of your work. But I want to talk a little bit about your work beyond the camera. Everyone's very popular. You're very popular. Everyone knows about your work in front of the camera. But I want to talk a little bit about some of your work outside of the camera. I know that you're ambassador for the ACLU and for immigrants and for women's rights. Mm-hmm. Why are these situations or these experiences important to you, particularly on International Women's Day?
I think because of some of the things that I experienced. If you look at all the things I've done, whether it's EndoFound, which is the Endometriosis Foundation of America that I co-founded with my surgeon over a decade ago, it's always because I've had some personal experience with the issue that I'm advocating for. I think in my life, as I was trying to find my way professionally, I did feel like there was an invisible wall that I could never decipher or understand how to maneuver around. And a lot of times, I also didn't have mentorship because, I didn't have anybody doing the things that I was doing, writing, being on television, etc. And so, I wanted it to be really different, hopefully, for the next generation of women and people of color, but just anybody, just to have an equal playing field. And I felt that shortly after the 2016 election that things were just coming to a head in a very intense and acute way as far as using certain xenophobic tropes and sexist tropes to really forward the agenda of one group of people versus understanding that we live in a republic that's a democracy and that we should all, we're not all equal, right? Some of us are great at basketball, some of us are great at cooking. You can guess which one I'm good at. But, but we all should have the equal opportunity to develop whatever is innately, special about us, right? And so I wanted to make sure that I was counteracting a lot of the things that I saw, which I felt were really antithetical to what actually made this country great. And so I started working with the ACLU. I started speaking out about immigrant issues because as an immigrant and someone who's lived in immigrant communities for most of her life, my experiences growing up in those communities did not match the rhetoric that was being spewed all over the airwaves by Washington as a justification for a lot of policies or programs that were happening, including, but not limited to, obviously, the separation of children from their parents at the border. I was separated from my mother when I was 2, but in my case, I was, in the loving home of my grandparents until my mother got settled and could call for me. And so, even having the separation happened in the best condition possible, I do know how it affected me as a toddler. I do know how important that early childhood experience can be for all of us. And so it just spoke to me very personally. And it was really out of my experience working with the ACLU and really getting to understand much more deeply the issue of immigration as it affects people today. That made me want to do Taste the Nation, which is this other show that I have on Hulu. And, I just wanted to give the microphone to people who don't often get a chance to speak for themselves. And it's been really rewarding. I have to say that when you are finally able to match what your passionate about, what you spend time thinking about anyway, all the time with your professional endeavors. It's a really gratifying place to be, and I'm very lucky to have had the opportunity to do that.
Well, let's talk a little bit more about Taste the Nation, which was born out of COVID. The restaurant industry has been one that has been one of the hardest hit in this pandemic. Why was that endeavor important to you? And how do you see kind of the Top Chef franchise playing a role in terms of making sure that these small businesses, I've seen just startling statistics in terms of how many restaurants are having to close in this pandemic, how that industry is going to see a path forward?
I mean, I think it's very difficult. I think the restaurant industry will have to evolve and adapt to the new landscape. I don't think all of the restaurants that we saw closed down will come back, especially those mom and pop restaurants that are often family run, often immigrant family run, often female led, where they're really just living month to month. Like they're paying the invoices of this month from, or last month from the money they're bringing in this month. So you can see very quickly how if you close down even for a month, you're in the red. And so I think there's a certain echelon of restaurants, that are much higher ticket value per seating. They will come back because there is a sliver of the population that will always patronize those restaurants. And that sliver is the same sliver that is probably not as adversely affected as far as the customer base, but as well as a business, running that fancy restaurant, say. I think that a lot of times, when these restaurants close, we don't understand the ripple effect that they have on the economy, but also on the community, and also on the education and the education level of the families, the children of those people that often have limited choice about what they do for a living. And the reason that a lot of restaurants are immigrant owned is because, everyone knows how to cook their food, right? So if you're a good cook and you're willing to work hard, you can at least start something. You start like a hot dog stand or a food truck, and then, go up from there, as is the case. And at, in Taste the Nation, we feature a lot of those types of restaurants. We also have a couple of Michelin-starred chefs on there. And then with, Top Chef, I think one of the most beautiful things that we did very quickly is manage to work with the James Beard Foundation and partner with them on their Open for Good program. They gave out a lot of grants at the start, right when it happened. We thought we would be able to give more out, but the demand was so high that literally within days of launching the program, we shut the program down. It was all need-based, and they were very small. You had to have less than 50 employees in order to qualify for that. But the money just evaporated so quickly because the need was so great. I mean, the restaurant industry is the second largest private employer in this country. And I don't think that we're going to see a rebound for a while, for a long time. I mean, for Top Chef, we go to a different city every season. We try to focus and highlight all the little nuances that make that city great from a culinary standpoint, but also to look for those business owners that actually are doing the work of bringing new cuisine to these cities, are employing people, etc. And those are the ones that are most interesting to me.
Right.
And that is certainly the case. I mean, Top Chef will be back on
season, right, in April?
April 1st we premiere, and it was a very difficult shoot. We shot during the pandemic in Portland, and I'm so happy that we did shoot. First of all, we put 150 crew members back to work, including the people you see on the screen, but also all those people you don't see. We also were able to highlight some of the wonderful positive things about Portland and its food scene. We did an episode on Pan-African cuisine that I was very moved by, and I thought was a really long time coming, for example. We also, got to taste the seafood and go to the Fruit Loop, and, all of these highlights that we take for granted when we go into a city, really in this season had way more resonance because we understood sort of the depth of what we were doing and how it could affect that local community. I mean, I loved Portland. I was sorry I didn't get to see more of it because I was on a very tight lockdown, as you can imagine.
Of course.
Um,
Yeah, it's a beautiful
I
city.
managed to get the season out miraculously.
Right. Padma, you talk about that Pan-African episode that you shot being a long time coming. I was so curious. I'm a huge fan of Top Chef. I've been watching since the beginning. In terms of what we were just discussing with Rachel and Minda and choosing to challenge biases, how have you seen and navigated the last 18 season in terms of biases against female chefs? The food industry is just such a male-dominated world. Have you seen the experiences, or have you been able to call out biases on the show in terms of how different guests are rated in terms of their food?
I mean, yes, we're pretty strict. I mean, the show is also female-led. Other than Tom, I mean, the host is female, the showrunner is female, the CEOs of our production company are female, and the head of my network is female. So we're pretty sensitive to that kind of stuff. And even from the beginning, when we do casting for the chefs, we make sure we practice very outright, affirmative action as far as genders. We try to get an equal amount, but the problem is that a lot of times the white male chefs that come on our show have been the beneficiaries of much better mentoring and experience that people of color or women, and especially women of color, have not had the opportunity to just receive. And so, it doesn't matter how innately talented a chef is, they do need the tutelage of someone senior. They do need the money and the resources to go and travel and discover food in other parts of the world. So, we try to do as much as we can, and I think we're getting better at it. It's been an issue, as you can imagine, that's really important to me, and one that, I lobby all the time for, but also so do my producers. And I think, what we need is intervention earlier in a chef's career before they get to the point where they can be considered for Top Chef. What do I mean by that? I mean that, for instance, all of these Michelin-starred chefs, it should be a condition before you get a Michelin star that you have X amount of people that you employ that come from different places, that are both women and men or non-binary, whatever it is. And it should also be a requirement that every culinary school, in order to get, accredited as it, to get college credits for, should have to teach African-American history, African-American culinary history, African-American food traditions, because they are deep and they run, very far back to West African countries, way beyond our shores. And we need to address that. And by the way, it's also really interesting. If you're interested in food, you're interested in this stuff. And so I want every culinary school in this country to teach indigenous traditions and indigenous foods. I want every culinary school in this country to teach African American food. And possibly, even have a couple courses on immigrant cuisine and what the landscape of the country's food looks like, because it's ever evolving. What is American food in the 1940s versus the 1980s versus today? Well, it's a lot different. And, if you don't educate people going into that industry, your industry also will suffer long term. I mean, I believe this just in general, the best thing you can do for the future and the economy of a country is to put money now, a lot of money, into education, because in 15 or 20 years, those people are going to go out into the workforce. And then in 40 years, they're going to be in the Senate and, on federal courts and running for office. And so, America does not have a history of thinking long term. And the culinary industry is just another example of that. It's gotten better, though. We have so many more female chefs today that now that they have the power and decision-making power, to hire other women and other people of color, they're doing it. I can think of many more female chefs today than I could have 10 years ago. So that's really good news.
Progress is definitely happening. Padma, I want to quickly say hello to some members who are joining us in the stream right now. We have Stephen from New Jersey, Elizabeth from Boston, Sylvia from Vancouver, and Donna from Texas joining us on LinkedIn News Live. Thanks for joining us on the show. Padma, I want to go back to, you called it an invisible wall earlier, where you felt like throughout your career, whether it was in modeling or entertainment or food, there was just something there. And part of the reason we're having this conversation for change right now on LinkedIn News is I want to get through that wall a little bit. What's changed in terms of these industries that you've broken through, and what were some of the challenges that you faced?
Well, I mean, as an actor, I faced just getting in the room. If you talk to me on the phone, I've gone to school in America, and I'm very tied to my family in India, but I'm basically a product of the American public school system. I've grown up here. And if you talk to me on the phone and I told you my name was Peggy Smith, you might not know any differently. But because my name is Padma Lakshmi, and because I'm brown skin, and it's not a name that casting directors immediately recognize, they'll just assume, oh, well, this role isn't for a quote unquote ethnic person, or we didn't write it that way. But you don't have to write something a certain way. Like, if you look at any hospital in this country, it reads like an Indian phone book, because of the shortage of medical professionals in the 70s and the visas that were given, and those people came over just to fill those jobs. My mother came over on a visa like that. But you don't see that still. You didn't see anything like that on St. Elsewhere, for example. And towards the end of ER, you started to see it, but you haven't really seen it. What's happened now is that, more women have gotten in the position of power. More casting directors are of color. And so they're saying, wait, this is not when I go to the grocery store, this is not what the population looks like. And so that is what's making it better. I mean, now I just got a script the other day for somebody of Indian descent. I would have killed for an audition for a role like that 20 years ago. It just never came to me. I just didn't have access to it. So there are changes being made. And they're being made slowly, but I don't think it's any easier for a white female actor to get work than it is a non-white woman to get work. But I do think that white woman has a real definitive edge in getting in the room, at least.
Absolutely.
And so a lot of roles that don't need to be written as male or female should be gender neutral, and they should just find the best person for the job. Small changes like that. It's just a change in mentality, and the most you can ask for by anyone in a position of power who gets to cast, gets to decide, gets to choose, should be that they're open. That's all you can ask. I mean, I'm sure I am full of biases as well. I live in the same planet as everyone else, but I think if you can be open to saying, hold on, let's look at this script. Does this person have to be male? Can that person be Black? Like, is there any reason why this role can't be filled by an Asian or Latin person? If the answer is no, then we need to go and cast specifically a non-white person, just to even the playing field.
Right.
Because I think that also makes a richer cast, a richer show. It just
Right.
The newness of it is also creatively exciting. It's not just being someone who's trying to do good. It's like, listen, I want to hear a story I haven't heard before, and there are millions of stories to tell.
Absolutely. And what has been encouraging, at least on my end, is we are seeing companies like Netflix put together foundations and pledges to do just that, to diversify the types of programs that they're putting in front of all of us. And it is so important. Padma, before I let you go, you wear so many hats in the professional world, but I want to talk to you a little bit as a mother. We've just seen so many working mothers struggle throughout this pandemic. And what's your message to your daughter when you look at her and you think about the career that she could have? What's your message to her? And for the girls who are joining us right now on the stream, I see so many members weighing in. They're just so excited to be here with you. What's your message for the next generation of women? How can we make the career world more equitable for them?
I think the thing you have to do, first of all, is find what you're good at and what you're passionate about and what you would normally wind up spending your day doing, whether it's singing or cooking or, accounting. Whatever your proclivities are, push against the open door, lean into those. Don't have any ego about what you should, quote unquote, do for a living. Do what you love. And then once you do that, you have to find people in your industry that you can literally target, which is something that I didn't do, okay? It's just finding the people who align with your aspirations and who you admire and watching them. And, now with Google and YouTube, it's so easy. And, just inhaling everything you can every time they do an interview, every time they write an article, even if it's in, whatever it is, and watch their career and get some kind of tutelage just from afar, even if you've never met them. Those are the two things I think you can do. And then, from that, on places like LinkedIn and other places, just look for the people who are doing what you're doing. And it really matters who you surround yourself with, what you spend your day thinking. Do not divorce what you do for a living from what you do in your leisure time. And I don't say this to say you have to work 24 hours a day all your life. I just say, be constructive even in your leisure time, because often the things that you absorb there will help you in a professional setting. And if you're doing something you love, then that's not a chore, it's a pleasure. It's somebody who loves food, then taking a photography class and then going and shooting food versus animals, right?
Absolutely. Well, as someone who is not good at cooking at all, Padma, I will say thank you for joining me in this conversation. Thank you for not saying at some point in this conversation for me to pack my knives and go.
Oh, no.
Burst into tears, but I so appreciate all the work that you're doing and for joining us on LinkedIn News Live.
Thank you so much. Happy Women's Day.
That was Padma Lakshmi, author, producer, and host of Top Chef. She's also the author of the upcoming book, Tangy Tart, Hot and Sweet. All right, tomorrow on LinkedIn News Live, we continue our Conversations for Change series with actor and director Issa Rae and former journalist and CEO of D&Z Media Acquisition, Betty Lou. Turn in to hear how they fared during the pandemic, why they believe the work needs to be done more equitably, and why allyship means so much to them. I'm Caroline Fairchild. Happy International Women's Day, and thank you for joining us on LinkedIn News Live.